That's what you said, right, Larry? 29. 1 Samuel chapter 29 will be our next in the, we're getting close, 30, 31 after this. I may merge them next week because Mish and I are going away on the, well, I'll be gone from the pulpit on the 13th, and it'd be nice to finish it up. So I'm going to try to merge 30 and 31, but we'll see if that happens. But for today, 1 Samuel 29, I will read it and then pray. This is the word of the Lord for us today. Now the Philistines had gathered all their forces at Aphek, and the Israelites were encamped by the spring that is in Jezreel. As the lords of the Philistines were passing on by hundreds and by thousands, and David and his men were passing on in the rear with Achish, the commanders of the Philistines said, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" And Achish said to the commanders of the Philistines, "Is this not David, the servant of Saul, king of Israel, who has been with me now for days and years? And since he's deserted to me, I have found no fault in him to this day." But the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him. And the commanders of the Philistines said to him, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place to which you have assigned him. He shall not go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he become an adversary to us. For how could this fellow reconcile himself to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of the men here?" Verse 5. "Is not this David, of whom they sing to one another in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Then Achish called David and said to him, "As the Lord lives, you have been honest, and to me it seems right that you should march out and in with me in the campaign. For I have found nothing wrong in you from the day of your coming to me to this day. Nevertheless, the lords do not approve of you. So go back now and go peaceably, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines." And David said to Achish, "But what have I done? What have you found in your servant from the day I entered your service until now, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" And Achish answered David and said, "I know that you are as blameless in my sight as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said, 'He shall not go up with us to the battle.' Now then, rise early in the morning with the servants of your Lord who came with you, and start early in the morning, and depart as soon as you have light." So David set out with his men early in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines, but the Philistines went up to Jezreel. Let's bow and pray. Lord God, in the reading of your word, I pray that you, more of you would be revealed to us, Lord, that through this story we can hear your teaching for today for us. Lord, we pray that you would bring out your truths to our minds, to our hearts, correct us where we need correcting, comfort us where we need comforting, admonish us where we need admonishing. Lord, let your word have free reign over us this morning as we let it settle in our hearts and in our souls. And these things we pray in Jesus Christ's name. Amen. Please be seated. So this is the third now in the third chapter in 1 Samuel that is very peculiar again. We looked at that last week. 27 and 28 were unusual, unexpected, even uncomfortable chapters of what's going on in those chapters. David, the man God called to be king over Israel, an anointed king over Israel, to lead the country out of repression and lead them into to be the country that God designed them to be. And yet he flees and defects to the Philistines, the enemy. And then we took a little break or a little cutout from that, and we saw Saul seeing the gathering of the Philistines as they were about to attack, And Saul, when he was pressed with the pressure of being the commander and the king of Israel, when he was pushed, what came out was, I got to go see a medium. I got to go see a witch. I got to go see a fortune teller to tell me what to do, because God did not answer, because Saul had rejected God many times and was disobedient to God. So God remained silent when Saul prayed to him. And we saw, Saul's encounter with this witch, and Samuel was brought up from the dead and spoke to Saul. And again, very kind of strange occurrences. Yet they're in the scripture, and we found over the last couple of weeks that there are ways the Lord speaks to us through those things. And now we come to chapter 29, and we see this man, David, who, again, called to be and chosen by God to be the king of a nation, the king of Israel. And now he's preparing to fight against Israel, even to the point where it may very well come to pass that he would have to kill the king of Israel, and maybe even his son, Jonathan, who was David's best blood brother friend, right? They were inseparable. They were the greatest of friends. And now David is posturing with the Philistines to go to war, to go to battle with Israel, with Saul and Jonathan and the army of Israel. So it's very awkward, sort of. And I don't know, really, it's a sort of a tough passage to preach, because it's so clear, detailed what's happening. I mean, the details are tremendous. They have this sort of a pass and review. If you're in the military, you know what that's like. They march the forces past somebody who's reviewing them. I mean, they do it before the president, they do it before visiting general, they do it before a head of state or something, where the military, and they're marching all in unison, and they march their weapons by, and they're all well-trained, well-executed formations. And I just see that happening here. Now, I don't know who they're passing in front of and being reviewed by, because Achish is at the back, or in the rear of all these forces passing by, and David is with him. But they were certainly getting ready to go to war. And now we see David with the king of Gath, the king of the Philistines, and the commanders see the Hebrew people, see David and his, 600 men, I think he had with him. And he says, hey, what are these Hebrews doing here? And Achish makes a case for David, saying, hey, he's all right. He's okay. He's defected to me, or deserted to me, and he's been spotless for the last year and few months, the days and years. He's had no fault in him. But the commander of the Philistines didn't like that. They were kind of sharp guys, I think, and they were angry at the king. Now, he must either be a weak king, or they're very strong, powerful military commanders, or both, because they insist that David will not go to war with them on their side. Now, there's one verse in this passage I'm going to focus on a little bit later, and we're just about where that verse is. In verse 4, sort of in the middle, it says, or towards the end, it says, for how could this fellow reconcile himself to his Lord? Just think about that verse for a moment. I'm not going to talk about it yet, but I have it starred and underlined. So I want to spend a little bit of time with that later. So the lords of the Philistines, or the commanders of the military, say, David is not going to fight with us. He's not going to fight with us. He's going to turn on us. We don't want him on our side. Get rid of him. So Achish calls and kind of, softens it up with David and says, oh, they don't want you to fight. You better beat it for now. And David, probably some of the most frequently voiced words from David are, but what have I done? What have you found in your servant? From the day entered your service. He said that to Saul multiple times, right? At least 2 or 3 times. And now he's saying it to Achish. And Achish says, I know you're great, you're awesome, you're wonderful, I believe in you, you're a good armor bearer, you're a good bodyguard, but you can't fight with us. So go back to Tiglag. And so David goes. So what I'm going to do here, because I thought it was interesting that if I labeled this sermon, which I don't really put a title on it anymore, I would say, will the real David please stand up? Will the real David please stand up? Because there are 3 perceptions of David in this story. There's the perception that Achish has of David. There's the perception that the Philistine commanders or the lords of the Philistines have of David. And then there's actually 4. There's the perception that David has of himself, right? And then, which I'll talk about at the end, is there's the Lord's perception of David. Okay, so there's really 4, right? But I'm going to focus on those 3. The commanders, Achish's, then the commanders, and then David, who each think that David is. So let's look at Achish first. Achish, the king of Gath, the king ruling the Philistines at this time, he sees David as a solid guy, a guy who deserted from Israel, came to him, has been serving him faithfully for, I think it was a year and, how long has it been? A year and 4 months, it says in 27:7. He lived in that country, the Philistines, for a year and 4 months. So it was a little over a year that David served Achish, and he was without fault. He did everything right. Just like he would have and did with Saul, if Saul didn't, try to kill him. So Achish believes in David. All the visible evidence is that he's full of loyalty and faithfulness. Achish said back in the end of chapter 27, he said, he has made himself an utter stench to his people. Therefore, he shall always be my servant. What an endorsement of David to have a king have such faith in you and trust in you. So David thought that, Achish thought that David was spotless, bulletproof, the guy you want at your side when you go into battle. And then we see the Philistine commanders. They have a whole different view of David, don't they? And we see this in verses 3, 4, and 5. They say, who are these? What are these Hebrews doing here? This guy, send him back. We don't want him fighting with us. How would he reconcile himself to the Lord, but by taking the heads of the men here? And they've heard the songs that were sung about David probably several years before this, and they want nothing to do with him. They think he's a turncoat. They think he's a phony. They think he's a spy. They think he's unloyal because he's unloyal to Israel, to his original people, and they want nothing to do with him. To them, he's the enemy. To Achish, he's the greatest bodyguard. Now, you see this different perceptions of the same guy? And then we see David, what he, thinks of himself. And this is a tricky part. The hard part about this passage is it's sort of ambiguous. Nobody knows where David's loyalties are. Nobody knows where his heart is. Did he have enough of his people, enough of the Hebrews? He said, I was trying to be faithful. All I did was, Saul tried to kill me. My own people gave me up to Saul to kill me. Remember I don't remember the name of the people. But the people in the area where he was hiding, the Ziphites. Remember the Ziphites? gave him up to Saul a couple different times. They went to Saul trying to get in good with the king and said, oh, David's hiding in the wilderness over here. You can find him there. And Saul would go and try to kill David. So David might have had it with all of them. He might have said, look, it's got me nothing to be a good servant of Saul, a good servant of the king, a good fighter for him. It's gotten me nothing. So maybe, we don't know, maybe he really intended to defect or desert to the Philistines. Or the other possibility is maybe he was just a tremendous military mind and thought he would infiltrate the Philistine hierarchy in the Philistine army and the king, and he would get to know their methods, their sources and methods, and their war fighting abilities, so that when time comes, he can turn it all back on them. But he would have invested. It would have been a great feat of deep cover. You know, those of you who watch either detective or military shows, deep cover, a great spy story here, if that were the case. And we just don't know. We don't know where David's heart was. He could either be pulling a great ruse on the Philistines, or he could be fully in. And the hard thing to preach about this, and the hard thing when you're reading it, is we just don't know. And we don't, and there's no way to know. And I've read the commentaries, and the commentaries are saying the same thing. They're saying it's ambiguous. There's no way to know where David's heart is. But David may not even know. You ever done that? You ever been so... and now he clearly lied to Achish in the past. He clearly lied to Achish. He said that he was... Achish would ask, where have you made a raid today? And he said, against these people, against these people, against these people, when in fact, he killed the friends of the Philistines, those who were kind of in tight with the Philistines. Achish thought he was killing his own people, the Israelites, who were the enemy of the Philistines. So David was certainly lying to him. But maybe he was justifying in his own mind, David was justifying in his own mind why he was doing some things, and he started to believe, maybe he thought he was being a faithful servant to Achish. Maybe he was being completely deceptive to him and had a whole nother motive. We just don't know. We just don't know. And I wish I could be more, precise about this, but there's no way to know. But the Philistines, it's interesting that, remember last week we talked about the one person who feared God the most. Remember who that was? The medium. Yeah, the witch at Endor, the medium at Endor. She was the one who said, hey, what are you doing? I don't want to, Saul kicked us out. I don't want to get involved with this. And then when Samuel was raised up, she's the one who screamed out with a loud voice because she wasn't expecting it. And she's the one who took care of Saul afterwards. And now in this chapter, we're kind of seeing the same thing, that the ones who are sending David back so that he wouldn't be killing his own people are his own people's enemies. So, I mean, it's like the Philistine commanders, who were at one time David's worst enemies, are now the ones who are keeping him from doing something that is going to destroy his reputation, like Abigail did with Nabal. Abigail saved David from making a huge mistake by going in and killing Nabal. Now the Philistine commanders are saving David from making a huge mistake by killing his own people. And it's just very strange. But the thing is, God will use even David's enemies, and he'll even use our enemies to take care of his chosen ones. So he loves us so much. He loves not just David, but the nation of Israel so much that he actually God moved through the Philistine commanders and the lords of the Philistines, interchangeable term, to prevent David from doing something that would have ruined God's whole plan. And God will not let his plan be ruined. So God worked through the Philistine commanders to get David out of the fight. Now, David, again, he might have been so invested in serving the Philistines that he might have forgotten. He might have forgotten his calling to be the king of Israel. And he might have said, look, they're accepting me. I mean, Achish accepted me. I have a home here. I'm building a community, because he had 600 men and their families. So, and he was given the region of Ziklag. So he was building his own little community, right? And things were going pretty well. So maybe he's thinking, hey, all my time in Israel got me nothing. Here I am in the enemy's land, the Philistine land, and I'm prospering, right? I'm flourishing. My people are happy. We have a good land here. Maybe he was just so deceived himself that he lost sight of his purpose. Again, we don't really know. But the Lord knows, and the Lord's purposes will be carried out. And the Lord, even though David, for whatever purpose, was about to go to battle against his own people, the Lord didn't let that happen. So he has three sort of identities, right? Three people, himself, Achish, and the lords of the Philistines, looking at him differently. And he's playing all these different roles, sort of, right? And it led me to think, do we ever do that? Do we have multiple personalities? Are you the same person on Sunday morning as you are on Wednesday evening or Saturday evening or Friday evening? Or do you have a bunch of people, do you have an Achish or a bunch of Achishes who think you're one person, and a bunch of church people who think you're a whole nother person, and you yourself probably get lost in who you really are? Do you ever have that happen? I had opportunity several times to live two lives. I mean, I could tell you what you see is what you get, but you don't have to believe me. I mean, that's what a good deceiver would say, right? What you see is what you get. But I mean, I'm being sincere with you. All I can say is that. But when I used to travel to Fort Meade, Maryland, for the reserves, Air Force reserves, down around NSA, nobody knew I was a Christian. I just go down there and work with a team of people for a few days or a couple weeks and then come home. Nobody knew I was a Christian. Nobody cared, really. I had a job to do and I did it. I could have lived a whole different life down there. I didn't, Mish. I didn't. But I could have. I know. I see the raised eyebrow. It's like, oh, we're going to have a talk tonight, right? But I could have lived a whole different life down there. And nobody would have known. But what happens is, what's happening to David is, when you do that, you got to keep track of a lot of things, right? You got to keep track of all the lies you're telling to the different people, because you have to know how to protect those lies, right? And David, if he was playing a game with the Philistines, that he must have had a brilliant mind. I couldn't keep it all together, but he must have had a brilliant mind. If he just gave up on his people and was fully invested in the Philistines, then he was deceiving himself, because he knew somewhere deep down that he was supposed to be king of Israel. But coming back to us, I wonder if many of us have multiple personalities and are trying to juggle that in our lives. And which you have to ask yourself, which is the real me? Which is the real you, right? Because at some point, you may even lose sight of that, like David might have. But the fourth view of David is what God sees of him. And we have the same God, right? That loves us, that we love and that we serve. And he knows his purpose for us. And we have to get out of ourselves sometimes and let him, and just surrender to him and say, Lord, I've made a mess of my life. I don't know who I am anymore. You ever say that to you? I don't know. Maybe it happened when we're young, but sometimes when we're old or midlife crisis. I don't know who I am anymore, Lord. I've been playing too many fields. I'm this to this group of people. I'm this to this group of people. And finally, you have to say, Lord, I want out of all that. I'm just yours. I'm yours, oh Lord. And he will take you and he will begin to fix things. It may not be right away, but he'll begin to fix things so that you come alongside him in his will. Because there is a real you, and that real you is how God sees you and the purpose that God puts you on this earth. That is the real you. So be done with trying to, defect from the church. Be done with trying to please other people. Be done with faking it with people, and just tell the Lord, Lord, I want my identity to be what your identity, what you know my identity to be, what you've called me to be in my identity. So, when we come into the presence of the Lord on a day like today, come to church, sing the songs, hear the prayers, read the scriptures, we're sort of stripped naked, spiritually speaking. All our pretenses, all our defenses, all our preconceptions of ourselves, all our lofty opinions of ourselves, all our lies are all stripped away from us. And we stand in the presence of the Lord who sees us who we really are. And the amazing, miraculous thing about that is that he still loves you. And he still loves me. And he can always reset our lives. And he can always fast forward or rewind or do whatever he wants to get us back on his track. And he's carrying out his plan for you, not according to your ability to do it, but because of his ability, his power to use us as he wants. So what was happening in our story today in chapter 29 is the Lord was moving the hearts of the Philistines to reject David, to kind of push him back to where he should be. Because that was the only way to save him from going beyond the point of no return, because that's where he was headed. And it wasn't just, and I believe I said it earlier, it wasn't just David that the Lord was working on or working with or working for, but it was because of his people, Israel. David was the man that God chose to bring Israel, to firm them up as a nation, to make them a united people, to deliver them from their enemies. So God had a perfect plan for Israel, and he was orchestrating this whole thing with David and the Philistines to bring about that plan. Now we, in Romans, is it 9 or 10? We are grafted into Israel, right? We are God's people, not in exactly the same way, but sort of the same as Israel was in biblical, the biblical record. But we are part of God's people, and he is keeping us safe. And he is not going to let us stray too far from our role as his people, from our citizenship in his kingdom. And he will move heaven and hell. He will move even our enemies to push us back to the place where he wants us to be. And I love the fact that God just cares so much about us, and his love is so unconditional and doesn't depend upon our worthiness, but he loves us because it's in him. It's his way to love us. that he will even use our enemies to get us back in. And I don't know if that's ever happened to you. It's happened to me once or twice. I won't give you any specifics, but it's like I might have said something, maybe not too appropriate in a certain, circumstance, and a non-believer, a pretty much an atheist or God hater, whatever you'd want to say, kind of rebuked me and said, "Steve, that's not like you. You're a Christian. You're a pastor." And I mean, it was just a stupid thing I might have said, but it's like God used them, a non-Christian, to rebuke me, to get me back to realize who I am, what my identity is. And that's in a very small scale. This chapter 29 is in a very big scale. God's using David's mortal enemies to reject him so that he would be forced to go back. And we're not gonna see that, unfortunately, because it happens in 2 Samuel. I'm not sure still if I'm gonna go there. Not gonna be right away. It might be after a few other sermons that I do. But David eventually does resume his role as king, and he's re-anointed, so to speak, as king of Israel, and takes his role in doing that. So, who are you? What is your real identity? What is your do you have all those balls in the air trying to juggle, between different groups of people? Or are you going to just say to the Lord, I don't care what other people think I am or who other people think I am. I want to be yours, period. Take me and do with me what you will. So I challenge you today to consider doing that. Surrender to him today. Tell Jesus you're done with trying to run your own life, and you get it's a dead end street, and place yourself fully in his care and see how he begins to work and how he begins to move. So that's chapter 29. David, in verse 10 and 11, David packed up and he went and he traveled back, I think it was southwest, to his home in Tiklag. And we're going to see next week what he finds when he gets there. So let's go to the Lord in prayer now, and then we'll sing a hymn.